Welcome back. What will I tell you? In the isolated hollow of Missouri Ozarks in 1892, two sisters did some disgusting stuff to their cousin, chained him in a cellar as a husband. Two sisters used him as breeding material for their sick, twisted fantasies. We're going to get into the twisted back history of this stuff right here. Let's get to it, shall we?
92, where families lived miles apart and strangers were shunned. Twin sisters Elspeth and Maeve Barrow kept a secret that would stain the land forever. When their orphaned cousin Thomas arrived, their bedridden father called it Providence. Thomas would preserve their bloodline. For 4 years he remained chained in the cellar, a husband in a holy union. When a child was born, the infant met a fate too horrific to speak. In 1896, the sisters' bodies were found in their brother's well, a confession beside them. Their faith was their weapon, their sin unimaginable. Subscribe and stand with us as we uncover the stories history tried to bury. Comment below with your city and local time. We want to know where these documented accounts reach across the world. The year was 1892, and in the deepest reaches of Taney County, Missouri, there existed a world that time seemed to have forgotten. The Ozark Mountains stretched across the landscape in endless waves of dense forest and limestone ridges, their hollows so remote that a man could disappear into them and never be found. This was not the romanticized frontier of popular imagination, but a harder place where survival demanded absolute self-reliance, and where the nearest neighbor might be an hour's walk through treacherous terrain. Roads were little more than rutted tracks that became impassable quagmires with every storm, effectively cutting off entire communities for weeks at a time. In winter, the isolation became absolute. Families who settled these hollows were often Appalachian migrants, people who had deliberately chosen remoteness, bringing with them a fierce independence and an equally fierce suspicion of government, law, and anyone who asked too many questions. The Barrow homestead sat at the end of one such hollow 15 miles from the nearest established town of Forsyth. The property itself was unremarkable by frontier standards, a modest log structure with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a root cellar dug deep into the hillside to keep provisions cool through the sweltering Ozark summers. What made the Barrow place noteworthy was not its construction, but its reputation. Josiah Barrow, the patriarch, was known in town as a man of peculiar and intense religious conviction. On his rare trips for supplies, he would speak in biblical cadences about the corruption of modern society and the sacred duty of keeping one's family separate from worldly contamination. Storekeepers and townspeople learned not to engage him in conversation, simply conducting their business and watching as he loaded his wagon and disappeared back into the forest. His wife had died years earlier under circumstances no one quite remembered, and after her passing, Josiah's visits to town became even more infrequent. The twin daughters, Elspeth and Maeve, were seen even less often than their father. When they did appear, usually to purchase fabric or lamp oil, they moved through town like ghosts, identically dressed in plain homespun, their faces expressionless, their eyes downcast. They spoke only when necessary, in voices so soft that shopkeepers had to lean in to hear them. Local women who attempted friendly conversation found their questions met with silence or single-word answers. One storekeeper's wife later recalled that the sisters seemed like two deer who'd wandered into a clearing, every muscle tense to bolt at the slightest sound. There was something unsettling in their synchronization, the way they moved and gestured in perfect mirror to each other, as if they shared a single consciousness split between two bodies. Neighbors who had occasion to pass near the Barrow property reported that the place was always eerily quiet, no sounds of conversation or laughter, just the ordinary noises of farm work performed in silence. The Barrow family had one other member, though he was rarely mentioned and even more rarely seen. Silas Barrow, the elder brother, had left the family homestead years before to live deeper in the wilderness. He had built himself a crude cabin miles from any other dwelling and survived by hunting and trapping, trading pelts for the few necessities he could not produce himself. Local hunters occasionally glimpsed him moving through the forest, a lean, bearded figure who vanished into the undergrowth at the first sign of another human being. Stories accumulated around Silas over the years, as they always do around such solitary figures. Some said he was simple-minded. Others claimed he had gone feral, that he lived more like an animal than a man. Children frightened each other with tales of the wild man of the hollows, though most had never seen him and never would. The truth was that Silas Barrow simply wanted to be left alone, and in the vast expanse of the Ozark wilderness, it was entirely possible to achieve that desire. Into this isolated world came Thomas in the spring of 1888. He was 17 years old, orphaned when both his parents succumbed to influenza within days of each other. Thomas was a distant cousin on his mother's side, and the Barrows were his only living relatives willing to take him in. For a few months that year, Thomas was occasionally seen accompanying the sisters on their infrequent trips to town. He was described as a thin, quiet boy with dark hair and a nervous disposition, someone who seemed grateful to have found a home after his loss. He helped load supplies into the wagon and stood slightly apart from the twins, as if uncertain of his place in this strange new family. Then, as autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, Thomas stopped appearing. When the storekeeper's wife asked after him during the sisters' next visit, Maeve, or perhaps it was Elspeth, no one could ever tell them apart, answered that Thomas had grown restless and left to seek work in Springfield or perhaps Kansas City. It was a common enough story in those times. Young men frequently left rural areas for the promise of wages in growing cities. No one thought to question it further, but inside the Barrow homestead, a different reality had taken hold. Josiah Barrow, bedridden by a stroke that had left him partially paralyzed but his mind still active in its twisted way, had called his daughters to his bedside soon after Thomas's arrival. In a voice that trembled with what he believed was divine inspiration, he told them that Providence had sent the boy to them. Their family line was pure, untainted by the moral degradation that infected the outside world, and it was their sacred duty to keep it so. Thomas, he declared, was meant to be their husband, not in the legal sense, which would require the involvement of worldly authorities they despised, but in the spiritual sense that mattered to God. The twins, who had known no authority but their father's their entire lives, who had been raised on his particular doctrine of familial sanctity and separation, accepted this pronouncement without question. What they did next would remain hidden for years, a secret buried as deeply as the root cellar where they kept their cousin chained. 4 years passed in silence. It was now 1896, and Sheriff Reuben Galloway sat in his office in Forsyth, reading a letter that had arrived by post from Illinois. The handwriting was careful and educated, belonging to a woman named Martha Hendricks, who identified herself as the aunt of Thomas, the boy who had gone to live with his Barrow cousins 8 years prior. She had written several letters to Thomas over the years, she explained, care of general delivery in Forsyth, but none had ever been answered. She understood that young men often neglected correspondence, but something troubled her about the absolute silence. Would the sheriff be so kind as to inquire after her nephew's welfare? Galloway folded the letter and looked out his window at the town square, where farmers were loading wagons and women were shopping for dry goods. He was 58 years old, a former Union Army tracker who had seen more than his share of violence during the war and had come to the Ozarks afterward seeking peace. He had served as sheriff for nearly 15 years, a position that mostly involved settling property disputes, tracking down the occasional horse thief, and turning a deliberate blind eye to the moonshine operations that everyone knew existed in the remote hollows. Missing persons cases in the Ozarks were complicated matters. Young men left for opportunities elsewhere constantly. Women married and moved away. Sometimes people simply walked into the forest and were never seen again, victims of accident or deliberate choice. The distances were vast, the population scattered, and record-keeping was haphazard at best. Galloway had no deputies stationed in the remote areas. He could barely afford to pay the 2 men who worked in town. Communication was limited to whatever, who news travelers brought, and whatever mail the irregular post riders could deliver. A man could commit murder in one hollow, and no one in the next hollow would hear of it for months, if ever. This was the reality of rural law enforcement in 1896, and Galloway understood that his authority extended only as far as the communities were willing to recognize it. In places like the deep hollows where the Barrows lived, that recognition was minimal at best. Still, the letter from Illinois nagged at him. Galloway was methodical by nature, a quality that had kept him alive during the war and served him well as a lawman. He made inquiries in town first, asking storekeepers and locals if they remembered the boy. A few did, a quiet youth who had come to live with the Barrow sisters. But no one could recall seeing him after that first autumn. The general consensus was that he had left for the city, though no one could say for certain. The storekeeper's wife mentioned that she had asked after him once and been told he had gone to seek work. It seemed plausible enough. Galloway decided he would ride out to the Barrow place himself, ask a few questions, and hopefully write back to the concerned aunt with some definitive information. The ride took most of a day. Galloway followed the main road south for several miles before turning onto a narrow track that wound through increasingly dense forest. The path was barely maintained, overgrown with brush that scraped against his horse's flanks. He passed 2 other homesteads on the way, stopping at each to ask if the occupants had seen the Barrow boy in recent years. Both families gave him the same tight-lipped response. They kept to themselves and expected others to do the same. One farmer, standing in his doorway with his rifle prominently displayed, made it clear that the sheriff's presence was not welcome and that whatever business the Barrows conducted was their own affair. This was the culture Galloway was up against. A wall of deliberate ignorance that protected everyone's secrets by protecting no one's. The Barrow homestead appeared suddenly as Galloway rounded a bend in the trail. The house looked well maintained, the barn sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin line against the gray sky. As he dismounted and tied his horse to a post, the front door opened and the twin sisters emerged onto the porch. They stood side by side, identical in their plain dresses and white aprons, their faces expressionless as they watched him approach. Galloway introduced himself and explained the reason for his visit, a concerned relative inquiring after Thomas. The sisters exchanged a brief glance, some wordless communication passing between them, before one of them spoke. Thomas had left years ago, she said, restless and eager to find work in the city. They had not heard from him since. It was unfortunate, but young men often forgot their family obligations once they tasted independence. Galloway asked if he might speak with their father. The sisters informed him that Josiah was gravely ill, bedridden, and unable to receive visitors. The sheriff asked a few more questions. When exactly had Thomas left? Had he taken any possessions with him? Had anyone seen him on the road heading toward town? The answers were vague and unhelpful. The sisters remained polite, but cold, their bodies positioned in a way that blocked the doorway, making it clear he would not be invited inside. Galloway looked past them into the dim interior of the house, seeing nothing but shadows and the edge of a simple wooden table. He had no legal grounds to search the property, no evidence of wrongdoing, only an instinct honed by years of tracking men who did not want to be found. Something was wrong here, but he could not articulate what it was. He left the Barrow homestead as the sun began to set, riding back toward Forsyth with more questions than answers. The investigation, such as it was, had reached an immediate dead end against the twin barriers of isolation and non-cooperation. Months passed with the Barrow case occupying an increasingly distant corner of Sheriff Galloway's mind. He had written back to Martha Hendricks in Illinois, informing her that her nephew appeared to have left the area years ago to seek employment elsewhere, and that while the family had not heard from him, this was unfortunately common for young men starting new lives in growing cities. It was an unsatisfying answer, but it was all he could offer given the circumstances. The sheriff returned to his regular duties, mediating land disputes, investigating livestock theft, and maintaining what passed for order in a county where most people preferred to settle their own problems. Yet something about the Barrow sisters continued to trouble him. He found himself thinking about the way they had stood on that porch, two identical figures blocking the doorway like sentinels guarding a tomb. He thought about the oppressive silence of that homestead, the way no sound had emerged from within the house during his entire visit. The first break in the case came unexpectedly in late summer when Dr. Edwin Cross visited Galloway's office on an unrelated matter. Cross was an older man who had practiced medicine in Taney County for over 30 years, riding out to remote homesteads to deliver babies and treat injuries that would otherwise go untended. After their business was concluded, Cross lingered at the door, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he asked if the sheriff was still inquiring about the Barrow family. Galloway straightened in his chair, suddenly attentive. Cross closed the door and sat back down, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the fact that they were alone. 2 years prior, in 1894, He had received an urgent summons to attend to a medical emergency at the Barrow homestead. When he arrived, he found one of the twin sisters in the advanced stages of labor. The birth had been difficult and dangerous, requiring all of his skill to ensure the mother survived. What troubled him, he explained, was the extraordinary secrecy that had surrounded the event. He had been blindfolded for the final mile of the approach, led by the other sister who refused to answer any of his questions. The father was supposedly bedridden in another room, but Cross never saw him. After the delivery, he had been paid in cash, and again blindfolded for his departure, with strict instructions that he was never to speak of what had occurred. Galloway leaned forward, his instincts suddenly sharp. Had the doctor seen the child? Cross shook his head. The infant had been taken away immediately by the other sister, wrapped in blankets. He had heard it cry once, a thin wailing sound, but then nothing more. He had assumed the child was being cared for in another room, though the absolute silence that followed had struck him as strange. As a doctor, Cross was bound by certain ethical obligations regarding patient privacy, which was why he had remained silent for 2 years. But the sheriff's earlier visit and questions had awakened his own concerns. Where was that child now? If one of the sisters had given birth, why had no one in the community ever seen the infant? And what about the father? Who was he? And where was he now? The implications of what Cross was suggesting settled over the room like a physical weight. A child born in secret, a missing cousin, a family that lived in complete isolation behind walls of silence. Galloway thanked the doctor and assured him that their conversation would remain confidential. After Cross departed, the sheriff sat alone in his office as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was one he hesitated to fully imagine. A young man arrives at a remote homestead and disappears. Years later, one of the women gives birth under circumstances of extraordinary secrecy. The timeline was suggestive, but not conclusive. Without a body, without a witness, without any physical evidence, Galloway had nothing that would justify a more aggressive investigation. The law in 1896 required more than suspicion, and the culture of the Ozarks made it nearly impossible to extract information from people determined to keep their silence. The case might have remained in this limbo indefinitely, a collection of troubling facts that never cohered into actionable evidence, had fate not intervened in the form of a timber rattlesnake. In early September, word reached Forsyth that Silas Barrow, the reclusive older brother who lived alone deep in the forest, had been found dead in his cabin by a trapper who occasionally traded with him. The death appeared to be from a snake bite, a common enough hazard in the Ozarks, where timber rattlers grew to impressive size and nested in the rocky outcroppings. As sheriff, Galloway was obligated to investigate any unattended death, even one that seemed straightforward. He organized a small party, himself and one deputy, and rode out to Silas Barrow's property, following directions provided by the trapper who had made the discovery. The cabin was even more primitive than Galloway had anticipated, a structure that seemed barely capable of keeping out rain, let alone providing comfort. Inside, they found Silas's body already beginning to decompose in the late summer heat. The snake bite on his leg was clearly visible, swollen, and discolored. There were no signs of foul play, no indication that anyone else had been present. It appeared to be exactly what it seemed, a man living alone in the wilderness who had encountered one of its many dangers and succumbed. They wrapped the body and prepared to transport it back to town for burial. It was as Galloway's deputy walked the perimeter of the small property, ensuring everything was secure, that he noticed the well. The well stood 20 yards from the cabin, its wooden cover sitting askew as if it had been hastily replaced. The deputy called out to Galloway, noting that the displacement was recent. The wood showed fresh scrape marks where it had been moved. Wells in the Ozarks were essential for survival, carefully maintained and protected from contamination. A cover left improperly secured was more than careless. It was dangerous. As Galloway approached, a smell hit him, faint but unmistakable, even in the open air. It was the smell of decay, different from the natural decomposition occurring inside the cabin. The sheriff and his deputy exchanged a glance that communicated years of shared experience in situations neither man wanted to confront. They removed the cover completely and peered down into the darkness. The well was deep, perhaps 30 feet, and the water level was low due to the dry summer. Something large and pale was visible near the bottom, partially submerged. Galloway knew immediately that they would need rope and help to retrieve whatever was down there. It took another full day to organize the recovery. They returned with additional men from town and proper equipment. Using a rope and pulley system, they slowly hauled up a large bundle wrapped in what appeared to be heavy canvas or oilcloth, bound with rope that had been tied with meticulous care. The bundle was waterlogged and incredibly heavy, requiring the strength of 3 men to lift it onto solid ground. As they cut away the bindings, the canvas fell open to reveal what Galloway had already known they would find: 2 bodies so decomposed that identification would have been impossible except for one crucial fact. They were dressed identically, and even in death, their physical similarity was evident. The Barrow twin sisters had been in the well for what the doctor who examined them later estimated to be approximately 3 months, perhaps longer. The condition of the bodies made determining exact cause of death difficult, but there were no obvious signs of violence, no bullet wounds or knife marks. The preliminary assessment suggested drowning, though whether they had entered the water alive or dead was impossible to determine with certainty. The discovery sent shockwaves through Taney County. The assumption that immediately took hold was that Silas Barrow had murdered his sisters and disposed of their bodies in his well, then died himself before he could be brought to justice. It was a tidy explanation that fit the facts as they were initially understood. Silas was known to be strange, possibly unstable, living like an animal in the wilderness. Perhaps he had harbored resentment against his family, or perhaps some argument had escalated into violence. The community, always eager to explain away darkness with the simplest available narrative, quickly embraced this version of events. But as the recovery continued, as the men worked to ensure nothing else remained in the well, one of them felt something solid that was not stone or mud. Using a long hooked pole, he snagged it and carefully drew it to the surface. It was a smaller package, also wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, clearly designed to keep water out. This package was no larger than a book, rectangular and flat. When Galloway carefully opened it back at his office, he found himself holding a thick sheaf of papers covered in careful, feminine handwriting. The letter began without preamble or explanation of its intended audience, as if the writer assumed that whoever found it would already understand the context. Sheriff Galloway carried the pages to the window where the afternoon light was strongest and began to read. What unfolded over the next hour was a confession that transformed the entire case from a simple murder into something far more disturbing. The handwriting was steady and clear, suggesting the letter had been composed over time with considerable thought, rather than written in a moment of panic or desperation. The author, she identified herself as Maeve Barrow in the opening lines, began by stating that by the time anyone read these words, she and her sister would be dead by their own choice, and that this account was necessary so that the truth would not die with them. She wrote about their father, Josiah, and the religious doctrine he had developed over years of isolation, a belief system that held their family as chosen, sanctified, and required to remain pure from the corruption of the outside world. She described how after their mother's death, this doctrine had intensified into something approaching madness, though at the time they had accepted it as divine truth. When their cousin Thomas arrived, orphaned and vulnerable, their father had called them to his bedside and delivered what he presented as a revelation from God. Thomas was Providence's answer to their need to continue the family line without introducing tainted blood from the sinful world beyond their hollow. He was to be their husband in the eyes of God, even if the law of men would not recognize it. Maeve wrote that they had not questioned this command because they had been raised to never question their father's interpretation of God's will. The letter detailed what followed with a clinical precision that made it even more horrifying. Thomas had been confined to the root cellar, chained to prevent his escape. They had taken turns bringing him food and water and subjecting him to what they had been taught to believe was a sacred duty rather than a crime. Maeve's letter continued with the account of her pregnancy, which she described as confirmation that they were fulfilling God's plan. The child was born in 1894 with the assistance of Dr. Cross, though the sisters had ensured he saw as little as possible. What Maeve wrote next represented the darkest turn in an already horrifying narrative. The infant had been born with severe physical deformities. She did not specify the exact nature, but wrote that they immediately recognized these abnormalities as a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. In their distorted worldview, shaped entirely by their father's teachings and their own isolation from any contradicting perspective, they interpreted the child's condition as evidence of demonic interference. They became convinced that their brother Silas, whom they had always regarded with a mixture of fear and suspicion, had somehow tainted the sanctity of their mission. Silas represented the wilderness, the untamed and ungodly, and they believed his very existence in proximity to their homestead had allowed evil to corrupt what should have been a pure and holy act. The letter described what happened to the infant with a matter-of-fact tone that was perhaps more chilling than any emotional language could have been. They had performed what they called a purification ritual, taking the child deep into the forest to a place they considered sacred and ending its life. Maeve wrote that they had believed this was an act of mercy, preventing a demon-touched creature from living in a world where it would only suffer and spread corruption. They buried the small body in an unmarked location that she did not specify.
Basically, this is a psycho family, okay? This happened a lot back in the 1800s. Even still today, it still happens like that. But good night, everyone.